Welcome to Killer Psychologist. I'm Dana Anderson, a forensic psychologist and your host of the show. Killer Psychologist is for true crime fanatics and anyone intrigued with the dark side of psychology. Today, we explore the recent release of Gypsy Rose Blanchard from prison following her conviction for her mother's murder. My co-host, Dr. Wetterer, and I discuss and emphasize the role of a forensic psychologist in these types of legal proceedings, which may involve examining a defendant's psychological state, assessing their IQ, and exploring their developmental history to help make an informed sentencing decision. We discuss court-ordered evaluations, which are not confidential, and what those implications are. In the case of Gypsy Rose, she endured severe psychological abuse by her mother, which is known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. We discuss how to assess this and what are the legal implications when it is wrongfully accused, as was the case with Taking Care of Maya, which resulted in a $261 million lawsuit. And finally, we delve into the long-term impact of psychological abuse on children and the effect it has on personality development. Join us as we gain a deeper understanding of cases like Gypsy Rose and others like hers. Killer Psychologist Podcast discusses themes of murder. Therefore, viewer discretion is advised. Hi, my name is Dana Anderson, and I'm here with my co-host, Craig Wetterer, and we're both forensic psychologists. Today, we're going to talk about some hot topics that are in the media today. One that has been just recently coming up this week is Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and she recently was released from prison after she murdered her mother 10 years ago. So there's mixed opinions about this. Some people seem outraged that she's released because she committed murder. Other people deem her as a hero, and there's a lot of questions and confusions on the internet. And that's where, as forensic psychologists, we can talk about this because we evaluate these types of individuals. We can make a diagnostic opinion. We can make recommendations for sentencing. And one of the things that I think people overlook is that, well, a lot of times people make assumptions about people. Well, you don't really know. As psychologists, we get all the medical records, all the criminal records. If I was ordered to evaluate her, I would do testing and find out more about her disorder. And whatever she's diagnosed with is important, and it can relate to sentencing or where she's sentenced to, as if someone might go to the state hospital versus prison. One of the things that I think is an important factor that often is overlooked is that what is her IQ, or if someone has a developmental disorder or they don't fully comprehend their situation or they're a child, there's a lot of factors to look at. And while I did not evaluate her, I would be curious to see what she was diagnosed with. And just keep in mind, she was a child at the time. And I'm going to segue a few different cases. And one that I always think of is The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis. And remember, the mother was putting pine sol in the food, in the soup. Remember that? And so that's what Munchausen syndrome can look like. It's now called factitious disorder. You're trying to impose a fake disorder on another person. So your child, so you could poison them, keeping them sick all the time, and then make it appear that you're this doting mother who's always caring for them and always sacrificing so much of your time to be caring for them. And it's complete manipulation. We can talk about how we've seen this in some child custody cases. Not only that, but partners have done it to each other. You know, poison your partner over time. I mean, there's, and of course, on a lower level, psychological manipulation, gaslighting. Oh no, you should be feeling fine. Or, oh, that's crazy. You're sick again today. So there's so much we can talk about today, but yeah, let's get into it. Craig, what do you want to say about Gypsy Rose Blanchard?
Looking at some of the, the media accounts of what's going on, because again, we, like you said before, we have not formally assessed her, so we don't know what her psychological state is currently and what it was, at the time of the murder. What I'd be interested to know a little bit more about, and I couldn't find it, maybe you did, but I would be interested to know whether she was formally assessed, around the time during the proceedings that led to her conviction for murder. And to see whether or not there was any, a full psychological evaluation done. It doesn't look like there was an assertion of an insanity defense. Did you see that at all anywhere? I didn't see that.
I didn't, and maybe that didn't come up. I came across some article that said she had about the mindset of a 7-year-old child. I saw an individual last night in custody who committed murder. The reasons aren't always what you think. And I'm going back this evening to finish my evaluation because I am going to give an IQ test. And these things are important.
Well, right. And the mother was allegedly medicating her, but giving her a number of different medications that likely had some, developmental impact on her during her development. So it would be interesting to know really what happened. How did that impact her cognitive functioning, the frontal lobes particularly, right? Because that's where the executive functioning lies. And so that's where decision-making is made. So when someone is impulsive and their frontal lobes are not functioning properly, we can oftentimes see impulsive acts occur, right? Without there being contemplation or, reflection, deliberation, those sorts of things. So her developmental state being, if they reported that as, she was a 7-year-old child, as a young adult, right? Then that does suggest that there's some type of neurodevelopmental disability and or an intellectual disability, right? So again, we probably don't have access to that data or that information in terms of what they found specifically, but that's what I would be looking at, obviously, is what impacts did all of these concoctions and medications that her mother was giving her over a course of many years, right? Especially a young child, obviously is making her sick so that she would seek medical attention. And that's really the crux of this factitious disorder, right? It's previously called Munchausen by proxy, being, the mother or parental caregiver was the actor here. And they're the ones that are, doing this for a number of different reasons, right? So there's a lot of reasons why a parent would do this. It's attention-seeking behavior in some cases. Like you said, it's the rescue syndrome where, look, I'm the hero, I'm rescuing my child here. And so there's a number of psychological things going on with the parental caregiver or the caregiver, right, that play into this as well.
Other factors to think about is even in utero, if the mother is consuming alcohol or other drugs, and those things I uncover when I do interviews, I find out, okay, this person doesn't have the same capacity that you and I have. And this is a developmental disorder, and they are a child. So when your parents abusing you, it's severe child abuse. They're lying, manipulating, brainwashing you. You're being poisoned. You don't have the higher level of cognitive thinking to maybe even understand that you can get out. You can get help. Who do you go to? Who do you trust? Your whole world is very, very small. They keep you captive in the house and keep your mind, there's psychological manipulation as well. And it's very confusing. And take your IQ and maybe cut it in half, because I see people who IQ's in the 50s, and publicly people can make such disparaging and hateful statements. And then you realize this person's, it wasn't this malice aforethought, or their mental state at the time was very confused, or severe brainwashing. You're a kidnapping victim and you're being held hostage for years and you want to escape, but you have limited understanding of the world or how to escape or how to get help. Now, people that leave these situations can maybe look back and understand more now about it. But it can be very traumatizing, and I don't think a lot of these people, it wasn't their first choice. They felt desperate, and I don't know Gypsy. I'm not speaking for her. I'm saying I've interviewed different people across settings in different situations, some that have killed their parents, and I know we could talk about the Menendez brothers because they're still in prison.
They are,
and
they're both still in prison.
They're not getting their Barbara Walters special, Barbara's not around anymore, but Gypsy Rose is getting that attention. So why do some people get 10 years and other people get life? And I think that's the question. And that is why it is so important to have a good forensic psychologist evaluate the whole situation. Because, and I was just telling somebody on the phone this morning why it would be important to have me evaluate their loved one in jail, because they might go to prison for a long time or not. Two very different things. It's worth it to see. You need a thorough evaluation.
Well, it doesn't look, I mean, again, I may have, maybe it hasn't been reported, but that's, again, I would want to know this. Like the pretrial proceedings, generally, the defense looks for asserting defenses. If they're going to assert a defense, it could be a self-defense, assertion, which is an affirmative defense, right? I think in the Menendez case, that's likely what they did. I'm recalling back, this trial took place in the 90s, but if you remember, what they were trying to do was they were trying to mitigate and explain that the murders were a result of this ongoing sexual abuse of, I believe it was Eric that was the victim of the sexual abuse, and perhaps his brother as well to some degree, and the father being the perpetrator. But that did not work. If you recall, the jury did not weigh that in terms of weight. They didn't assign any weight to that theory, that defense theory, and they ended up getting convicted. And I believe they got convicted. It's either first or second degree murder. It was likely second degree murder, but could have been first degree murder because they've been in prison since the 90s, and I don't know if either of them have a release date yet.
Yeah, I saw Rosie O'Donnell was very much advocating for their release, and I really want people to have some awareness if you're being so severely sexually abused by, in this case, the father. Do you know how you would react?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too, again, is I think the other issue with the Menendez case was that there was a question as to the validity of the claims, right? And so again, that when this was happening, it was never reported, it was never formally investigated. There was never a forensic exam done on Eric, right? So I always look at these, like this is something that certainly it could have happened. I'm not saying it did not happen, but in a trial, you're going to need evidence to confirm that. So in other words, if they're going to assert something like this, now in Gypsy's case, it's a little different. I think they had evidence, right, that she had been poisoned in the sense that she was being given medications that caused her to become ill. There was evidence of this. So that's a little, that would be a little bit different. So in terms of the defense strategy there. And so getting a 10-year sentence, that she clearly was not convicted of what in California would be like a first degree murder, right? Where that requires someone to have premeditation, deliberation, very different, right? Than a second degree murder, which could be, lacking that. In other words, they may have reacted emotionally, impulsively, but had not contemplated or premeditated it. That's the difference. And it looks like in Gypsy's case, that's what happened. Now, in the Menendez case, if I'm recalling the trial, and I can double check this, but I believe the prosecution did file first degree murder charges on both because of the lying in wait and because of the preparation in terms of getting the shot. It was a shotgun, I believe, that they used. And so a little bit different, facts. But again, the psychological mindset, that is something that we look at too, especially when we're doing criminal responsibility evaluations, right? We're looking at that mental state at the time that the crime was actually committed and, trying to answer a question of whether someone maybe knew that what they were doing was wrong, right? And if they didn't, due to a mental illness or mental disease, the jury will find them not guilty, like by reason of insanity in a case like that. But I don't think that was asserted either. In Menendez, they did a self-defense. That was the defense that they asserted.
Now, remember how it was found out about the Menendez brothers. So this is a case where when you see someone in therapy, it's confidential, and I can't tell anyone what we talk about, except, and we give the exception. So we do this all the time. That's a very important part of our job. Like every time I go to the jail, I explain it's not confidential. Anything you say to me, it's not confidential unless, court appointed, nothing's confidential. And so I had one lady almost walk out on me in jail the other day, but also I'm going to say you walked out on me and you didn't cooperate. So sit down.
I get those all the time. And sometimes it's like, okay, great. Yeah. You don't want to talk to me. Wonderful. Now I don't have to go through the undertake the assessment, right? It's
Right.
like,
I'm going to go,
okay.
I'm going to go shopping. I mean, you're still here in jail.
Yep.
It's going to prolong your legal proceedings. That's usually what I say. You're going to go back to your cell. And now you want to wait 30 more days for the second person to come try to interview and you tell them to F off. You can keep doing that for a while, although I don't recommend that. The judge.
Yeah, they tend to not like that.
No. So the Menendez brothers went to therapy, as I recall, and it's confidential. So you start talking about sexual abuse. So I think what happened is one of the brothers threatened. So if you threaten your therapist, like you're going to kill them, I can call the police, right? A duty to warn. Like I can protect myself. And so it's no longer confidential. That's where they went wrong. Telling someone you murdered someone is confidential in therapy, and people have a hard time sort of understanding that. They're like, no, it's not. In the past, people have you've killed someone, go to therapy. Like, I can't break that confidentiality. But if you tell me, well, I'm going to kill you if you go to the police, then I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go to the police now. So there's limits to confidentiality. Yeah. And I have had situations where I make it very clear, if you say these things, this will happen. And I usually have a very candid conversation. Like, you can tell me you killed someone and all the things, but there's to a point. So if you start saying, I'm going to go kill future people, right? Things like that.
Some of the information I had, I was just kind of looking at it again. And so what's interesting is that this Gypsy Rose case, she and her boyfriend, they were actually both charged with first degree murder because they had evidence of, premeditation, because there were text messages back and forth that suggested they were planning this stabbing. And so that's interesting because, again, it's the defense team in this case for Gypsy. They did the same thing that the defense team in the Menendez case did. They asserted self-defense, and they were using the argument that, she endured years of abuse of being, subjected to all these medical procedures that were unnecessary and so on, and didn't work. But what's interesting is that, they were convicted of this, right? They were convicted, or she was convicted of first degree murder, but got 10 years, which, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the state that you're in, first degree murder can generally give you 25 to life in most states. Some states, like in the southern states, it's life without. Or, if there's special circumstances in states that actually have the death penalty is imposed. Things like torture and, when you're, special circumstances. But that doesn't look like that's present here. But it's interesting, there are similarities between these two cases in terms of what the defense is trying to argue. But in both cases, those arguments were unsuccessful. And again, what I'd like to know is, and I can't find any evidence of this. Maybe you did, but where's the psychological or psychiatric testimony? If in other words, if they're going to assert this, was that done during trial?
Oh, I'd be so curious. One of the things about Gypsy Rose's case is that it was so televised on social media before this came out, unlike the Menendez brothers. The Menendez brothers.
Menendez.
Menendez brothers. Menendez brothers. I don't know, I'm making up stuff here. Okay. They weren't known until the actual murder, and then they're known. And so that changed the perception.
Well, also remember at this time, the Menendez trial, and I don't have the exact date, but I believe it was in the 1990s when it went to trial. And what came out, what started to become more, prevalent in the 1990s? Court TV. And so you had trials that started to become televised, like the O.J. Simpson trial being one of the big ones, right? That, that was when we first started seeing trials televised, or parts of trials televised. And that's when Court TV actually launched. So prior to that, the public didn't really have a lot of information or knowledge about some of these dynamics in terms of the psychology of these people that are committing murder until shows like Court TV came out, and now they're televising this. And so now, and then of course now we have, with social media, it's completely, everything goes viral, right? When we have some of these high profile cases, they go viral. I mean, look at the Kohlberger case, you've got all these citizen detectives, I call them, the ones that are, they're the cyber sleuths. They're out,
armchair
trying
detectives.
and sometimes they contribute, good information. They find evidence that law enforcement misses. Law enforcement doesn't catch everything. I should know. I spent a long time in that role.
Yeah. How long were you a law enforcement officer?
28 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Thousands of cases I investigated. Yeah.
And have you ever investigated a case like this?
Yes, similar. I'd worked part of what I did when I worked in the police department in Sacramento. I was assigned to a healthcare campus, to a hospital campus. I was actually they had 2 officers assigned there. It was such a large campus, and there were so many gunshot victims coming into the emergency room. You have all kinds of investigations that need to be initiated when people come in that are assaulted, seriously injured, child abuse. So lots of child abuse cases. And yeah, I did. I had a few where the suspicion was that the caregiver, the parent, it was a foster care situation. The parent was alleged to have been making their child sick. And it was the doctor, the primary care physician, that actually brought it to our attention. And so we investigated and looked into it. And, it was difficult because these are hard to prove too. So when you think about what you need to be able to demonstrate that the child abuse is occurring, is you need evidence tying that parent to either doing something in terms of giving a child something that is either poisonous or in some ways going to cause or induce illness. Think about how hard that is to actually prove if toxicology and blood samples are not collected at the time that these things are happening. So if the medical establishment isn't collecting that evidence, then all we have are circumstantial, statements and things like that may or may not be enough for an actual, like a criminal complaint filing for abuse. So these cases can be very, very tough. And it doesn't, obviously Gypsy's mother's deceased, but it's unclear whether she would have faced any criminal liability for what she's alleged to have done, I should say.
Right. Well, fraud also, because she would shave her daughter's hair and make her tell everyone she had cancer, gain money. And so it was a whole scam. So there was secondary gain, there was financial gain. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you can notice is that in situations like that, it creates forced dependency on your caregiver. And typically the outcome is you'll see those children grow up and have a dependent traits, if not dependent personality disorder, where they're overly reliant on a caregiver or person for their needs. You will see that a lot if someone has lower intellectual functioning and their caregiver overserves them or creates this dependency to them, and that's not healthy. And how it'll show up later in their adult life as they find a partner, and it's a strange power imbalance. So this affects people for a lifetime, and I see people, after these events and throughout their course of their life, and I'll test them, psychological testing, and I'll see some avoidant traits and some dependent traits, because they don't always know how to advocate and use their voice when they should be assertive, because there's just this conditioning to be silenced or not ask questions, to be overly submissive, overly dependent, because everyone wants to assume it all translates into PTSD or something. But a good psychological evaluation will look at the specific traits or outcomes for that specific person and how it's affected their life. And because people want to know, what's the treatment, or have you ever treated someone like this? And yes, I use testing to determine what issue is the most severest that they're dealing with or how they're coping with it. Have a specific action plan for that.
The cluster C stuff, right? So the avoidant personality architecture. So the schizoid traits can also come out too, right? So with people that don't know what schizoid personality looks like, these are folks that they tend to then want to be alone, isolate, and they're actually okay with it. They have not learned to socialize appropriately. And a lot of times when you have an abusive upbringing, whether there's physical abuse or sexual abuse, that can contribute to all of these sort of personality traits that we're talking about. It makes it very hard for people to be, to get into an interpersonal relationship when they have these problems.
Yeah, I love that you brought up schizoid personality disorder. I actually did an assessment this week in the jail, and the individual had schizoid personality disorder along with avoidant independent traits. And there was a history of abuse. And that's how it manifested. And so as severe isolation. So that it's so important to really understand. You don't really know if you're just an armchair detective at home and you don't actually get to see this behind the scenes. Most of the time people make assumptions and they're not quite right. And they can be grossly inaccurate, and it can be really hurtful. I would just keep that in mind. You don't always know the backstory about these individuals. I wanted to bring up Stephen King's movie, It.
Oh, that was back in the 1980s, or what are we talking? We're talking way back, right? But when did It come out? I remember watching the movie, but it's been a long time.
So the child actor, Eddie, his mother was doing some similar things, making him think he had asthma, making him have different issues, which developed problems for him socially, being neurotic or scared of things socially. It can make you just really distrustful or fearful. And he was a child and an actor, but you don't always know the backstory. This was happening and it really affected his life. Another interesting one was, I love this movie, growing up, The Secret Garden. The father kept his son locked in a house, convinced his son he was so sickly and disabled, crippled, couldn't go outside until his cousin Mary came over. I would have been the cousin Mary. I would have
get him out of there. Yeah. So there's a theory that kind of can explain why, and even children can develop this. And this is the learned helplessness model of understanding, and this applies generally, we use it when we're looking at domestic violence situations where you're trying to figure out why a spouse or a partner is remaining in a relationship that's abusive, where the other partner is being abusive to them. And so people on the general public might look at this and say, well, just get out, just, get away from this person. Well, why do they not get away? And the same thing applies in, children are more vulnerable just because they can't necessarily care for themselves unless they have another caregiver that'll take them. But, that can explain, I think, some of this, this learned helplessness, which is essentially just the person they don't see any other option for themselves. In other words, they become overly reliant or completely reliant on that other person. And they feel like they have no control over any outcome, for themselves. So that's where that helplessness comes in and develops in somebody. They are going to have a very difficult time getting out of that situation or that relationship. And I think you can see that in some of these cases as well, like particularly these with factitious disorder specifically. Because I think people often look at it and go, what the hell? Why would a child not go to an aunt or an uncle or somebody else and try to get some help if they recognize that something's wrong here? Well, that's this over-reliance, this, and also suggestibility and just the general vulnerability, right? So people who tend to be more suggestible, just by nature of their personality, I think are more vulnerable to be victimized like this. So there are personality differences that explain why we see some people falling victim to these things and other people don't. Other people get out, they either fight back or they leave, or they find a way to get out.
Yeah, and those are important factors, mitigating factors for sentencing. And a mitigating factor is a factor that could lessen the sentence. And if someone has an impairment, psychological disorder, developmental disorder, some factor that explains their behavior, those are things that forensic psychologists look for. And they're really important to assess for, because the difference is someone could get life in prison versus going 10 years at a state hospital, or utilizing the insanity defense, or a number of factors. Sadly, many people get unfair sentences and never were properly evaluated. I think one thing that is overlooked as a forensic psychologist that I see is I think we forget to look at IQ, while I'm not looking at a number here, but if someone has a developmental disorder, they have a deficit in their fund of knowledge, they have a lower IQ due to whatever issue, that is important. Right. It is a common cause for crime. And I see people, and I test their IQ, and recently I've done 50s.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is take your IQ, cut it in half, and you have just less options. And so I've seen people, one right now, a case I'm working on, this individual's facing 3 years in prison, and her IQ is probably below 50. That's a serious mitigating factor that never was assessed, but she's not this hardcore antisocial personality disorder. It's not any of these things, right? She has, and back in the day, you would call that, it was known as mental retardation, right? Now it's an intellectual disability, and it's on a scale, it's really something so important to assess. And sadly, one of the things I see is that people who have a lower intellectual functioning, they rely on their caretakers, teachers, parents, for the right information, and they overly rely on them as a way. And oftentimes through school, they skate through because they don't say they need help. The teacher says, "Do you understand?" They're like, and they don't. And then the legal process comes up, do you understand? So I ask open-ended questions. Tell me what I just said. Explain the legal process to me.
Right.
So we do competency evaluations all the time. And then when they're explaining it back, and
they don't have an understanding.
And you can see where their deficit is. They can't apply the knowledge. And you can't convict someone if they don't understand. So it is important to assess them. And so we do a lot of competency to stand trial evaluations. Can they understand the courtroom process and work with their attorney? And that's a confusing process for people because it has nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It's part of due process. It's part of your civil rights. It can't convict you if you don't understand what's happening. And so people can be restored to competency and get competency training so they can then return to court and participate in their defense.
Yeah, and just so the folks understand the frame of reference for intelligence, so in the general population, the average IQ. So, when I say average, I'm saying if we went out into the population, the average IQ is a 100, and then we use a standard deviation to kind of talk about how far someone is above average or below average. So when you just said 50 or 55, what you're saying is that someone's IQ that is at a 55, let's just say, that is 3 standard deviations below the average. And people have probably heard of the bell curve, which is we call a standard normal distribution. Someone down there on that end of that curve, at 55, we're talking about pretty profound impairments. These folks cannot work generally. And no, they oftentimes will not have the capacity or the cognitive capacity to understand the proceedings and to even be able to work with their attorney at any kind of, rational understanding, right? And you're right. I think it's missed quite a bit that intelligence is not assessed in many cases or brought up as, intellectual disability as sort of either mitigation and or, depending on the crime. If the person is, again, incompetent due to intellectual disability, oftentimes then if they're not restorable, and sometimes that's the case, right? They can't be restored because there's not much we can do, right? There's a ceiling effect as far as how much we can help restore them. And that's tough. So I've had a lot of cases where it's genuine, intellectual disability, not feigned intellectual disability. And we have ways of figuring that out too, where we just have to say that we have to conclude that the individual is not competent and not likely restorable. And then the court has to, or the prosecutor has to decide what they're going to do. They're going to have to drop the charge, and perhaps they pursue civil commitment proceedings if that person is considered dangerous, right, to the community.
Yeah, I see dementia patients in jail, some aging out criminals, some of them that are homeless or lived on the streets, consumed alcohol for decades. They can have a serious impairment, sometimes to the point where they're not competent, and they may not be restored. Once you get into some of that dementia and confabulation and just distorted thinking, part of our job is to not just inform the court that this person's not competent, but help the court, help everyone out. Let the defense attorney, the prosecution, and judge say, this is a neurocognitive disorder. This is something that may not be changed. And I recently did one of those evaluations, and I said, this may not change. It's not something that can be restored or go into the state hospital. That's an important role in what a forensic psychologist does. A lot of times the court or judge might order us to answer that as a specific question and do specific testing, and it's important whether someone has schizophrenia or not. It's really important. Now, we could talk about jail, people who, get shanked or poisoned in jail, and a lot of things happen that shouldn't. But recently, there's a case, 215 people buried behind the jail in Mississippi, which
I saw
got
that.
my attention to say, wow, okay, this mass paupers cemetery, that's a significant number of people. And so I went to check it out because things happen in prison. The thing is, some of these inmates, their family thought they were missing. They never even knew they went to prison. Here's the thing. Your loved one goes to prison, and you didn't even know, they die. And there's a duty to notify the family, obviously.
Yeah.
But how did we get to a point where we have this mass grave, and now it's being investigated and dug up? Who's responsible? And how did this happen? I have questions. I'm sure everyone does. How did it just get so out of control? And I always question, it's so sad, some of these people who really actually did have family that could have advocated for them or were looking for them. It's just so many questions, and the mystery surrounding their death. A lot of it seems suspicious.
Well, the civil rights attorneys are already on this. Ben Crump, I think, has this is undertaken representation of some of the families, right? And so, you're likely going to see a large investigation. It could be a federal investigation that's undertaken to figure out why, the families were not notified of these family members' deaths, and then again the circumstances of the deaths. It's unclear, at this point, how these deaths were classified, and did all of them come from the jail facility there, or were some of these individuals buried there involved in other events that led to their death? That's still not clear. There's just a number marking these graves, and so they're going to have to dig these graves up to figure out who these people are. And that's, if there's that many, can you imagine, the complexity of that investigation? I will definitely be interested to find out more on that. That's going to be a developing one that'll be interesting, as it develops. Something to definitely dive into. Yeah, and then finally, talking about Gypsy Rose and Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now known as factitious disorder. But going back, what signs, symptoms could we look for is what I always want to talk about. How many times was she taken to the doctor, or there was speculation, there was a report. I mean, there was these things. At what point is it investigated? When does someone step in? It is child abuse, and that is a crime that you should report if you suspect it. Anyone can report it and should, and you don't have to have proof. You could. Right. You don't. Yeah. The standard's much lower for it's just reasonable suspicion is the standard for reporting child abuse, for mandated reporters. But the general public, they don't, obviously people in the general public don't have a mandated requirement to report something like that. But I mean, clearly the warning signs for, looking for this going on is that you got to be careful because, some children actually do have legitimate, complex medical problems, right? And it may just very well be that they have a number of different things. They might have autoimmunity. They might have other conditions that cause a number of physical symptoms that require them to be seen by, a number of different doctors. they're trying to figure out what's wrong. So they're going to neurologists, they're going to cardiologists, they're going to all these different specialists. But the medical community is kind of the ones that need to be on guard for this, because they're the experts, right? In terms of, you get a child being consistently brought in for all of these sort of conditions or these problems and things. And again, some of this stuff is potentially induced, right? Where if they're being given medications they don't need, or supplements, or something that like the pine sol, right? Or somebody putting something in someone's food and causing them to become ill. We've seen those, right? Where someone is slowly being poisoned, like over time with arsenic and things like that. And sometimes there's no evidence or trace of some of this stuff, like when the toxicology is done, because that's the thing. You got to have the evidence that this is happening. And that's the hard part, right? So you don't want to falsely accuse someone either. So that's the other thing, a fine line. But medical professionals are the ones, but psychologists too, and people who are, if you're seeing a patient and you're starting to suspect something's going on here, with the child, or if you're seeing a child, look for those things. Obviously, those unusual patterns of symptoms presenting. They're not making a lot of sense. There's no sort of there's no reason why they should be happening in maybe an otherwise healthy child.
Yeah, I've had some interesting cases, and keep in mind it happens to elders, and it's elder abuse, and I see that a lot of times. They're poisoning them, they're taking over their finances, they're trying to make the person psychotic or appear to have impaired memory, take over conservatorship. I just had a case recently. All of those things happened, and the lady consulted with me. She was sharp as a bell. Before it even went back to court, they dropped it, conservatorship, because don't forget, it's criminal when you're, stealing money or poisoning someone, all these things.
Yeah. The big case in Sacramento back in the 1980s where, she was a boarding care, she had a boarding house. She was slowly poisoning these elderly people, and she actually killed them, and she buried them in her backyard in downtown Sacramento. And
that's exactly the type of care home that I don't want to be admitted to.
Dorothea Puente, she buried these folks in the backyard and was still collecting their Social Security, checks for a number of years.
So some financial motivation. That's one way to make a side hustle.
Right.
They died.
Right. Well, and the same thing with this case we're talking about. Her, the mother was obviously, there's financial gain there, right? My sick child, I need help.
Yeah. And a few things to look for is I do child custody evaluations, and I see some things, different types of abuse, all the types of abuse, but one person can be accusing the other partner of the abuse when it's them. It gets really convoluted. You can even make a child sick right before you drop them off, and then they're sick on the other parent's time. There's a lot to unpack there. I do make reports, and I had an interesting report recently where outrageous levels of abuse being inflicted on a child, and sometimes even in foster care. It's being reported by the parent. Their kid was taken away. So you just always, my advice is document, write down the quotes. It may be unbelievable or incredulous, but just document, just report just what they're saying. You go back later and it might all come together and make sense. I just be really careful with my quotes. So that's just important for documentation, because I make the report to CPS, Child Protective Services, or APS, Adult Protective Services, and then I've done my job and I talk about the limits of confidentiality. I'm reporting this. Please, they're going to be contacting you, follow up, give them the information. It's going to the police. Anyone can call and make a report, and I encourage people to. I have done many reports in my life. I want to bring up one final case, Take Care of Maya, and that was about a female mother in Florida, or her daughter Maya Kowalski. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but she was held, I believe, for 87 days in the hospital. She was placed in CPS, so it was John Hopkins All Children's Hospital in Florida. And as it turns out, she did have some health problems, and they wrongfully accused the mother of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And the mother was so distressed, fighting for her daughter, repeatedly taking her daughter to the hospital, advocating for her daughter's rights, trying to get her seen, spending money out of pocket. They got it wrong. They jumped to conclusions. They accused the mother. They reported her. She was not able to cope. She went home and killed herself. And it was tragic. The mother, at the core of her being, she wanted to help her daughter. And it became a lawsuit. May 1. It just gives me chills thinking of it. But that case, so much to unpack there. But looking at the professionals who responded to her, there was inappropriate behavior, texting, laughing, talking, assuming things, just being inappropriate and rude. And later those people had to go on the stand and say why they behaved that way. And just remember, at the end of the day, you will encounter unbelievable things. Truly, you will. And you don't always know who's telling the truth. And you may not be able to decipher that at the time. But if your role is you're a nurse and you're responding, and I know in that case, the mother was advocating for her daughter to have ketamine treatment, which there was conflicting opinions on that. People had opinions, the nurses did, and they were thinking the mother was not medicating the daughter properly. So there was opinions about that. And now we know a lot more about ketamine treatment now. It's benefits as
it's becoming more mainstream, right, for treating intractable depression and all of that. And but it's still controversial, in terms of using it in children. But yeah, that's why I brought up earlier. It's really important. You got to be careful when you make accusations. Again, if the accusations have facts in them that are not supported, in other words, they're false, and they're false, and you're sort of making them up to try to make a case, so to speak. Yes, you can be held liable. You can be, held liable for libel if you are writing this down, or slander if you're telling a significant number of people this and, broadcasting it, right, and projecting it out. So, you stay with the facts, right, and only the facts. And if you have reasonable suspicion that abuse is occurring, that's reportable. But this is a prime example of where you've got allegations that had no basis whatsoever, right? The consequences were very unfortunate, right, in terms of her committing suicide.
Lastly, I want to say it is a position of power to be a healthcare professional, forensic psychologist, nurse, and doctor, any of these people that came across Maya. And it was abuse of power, some of them, their own ego wanting to be seen as right, correct. I've made this opinion. It is correct. I am. And then you could be held to a level of like, wow, you're the savior complex. That's why I always feel it's so important. Whoever gets into this profession, make sure if you have a personality disorder or have some reasons why you feel you need attention or you feel you need admiration, or like this isn't the place to do it. And we do see these professionals in these positions, and it shows up later. We are held to such a high standard. So you just want to really, consult with your colleagues. It's okay to be wrong. Like, get feedback from your peers. These are very important decisions.
They are. And that's why, consultation is important as well. And so, if you're not sure, right, then consult with somebody that has more experience, and, bounce those concerns off somebody else before you go making an accusation, right? Like something like this. Like, that's always my recommendation. Get consultation. Talk to somebody else that has more expertise.
And that's why I consult with you. I love to consult because I want to make sure, even today I'm going to consult. There's 2 psychologists I'm going to call on a case we're assigned to. And I want to see if we all came to the same conclusion or any information we could share. I'm here to help. I'm not a standalone person. I'm here in my position to help answer questions, provide solutions, and all these outcomes are so serious. Well, great conversation today. So there's so much that we covered. And so I want to say that coming up, we did a podcast with a survivor of Munchausen syndrome by Proxy. And the individual, while I couldn't get Gypsy Rose on my podcast, I have someone else. And she went public with this for the first time. And we spent hours together. I think we split it up into 2 episodes. She had a lot to say. It's very tragic. Her mother ended up poisoning all the children almost to death, but got away with murder, killed her dad. It's an interesting story to hear. It's someone's lived experience. Where is she now? What is she doing? Well, she's a clinician now, supervises incoming clinicians as a licensed clinical social worker. And so I love that she's doing good and she survived. It's a tragic story. It's a bit sadistic. If you do listen into that, it goes all of the things that one encounters. But if you're interested in getting into forensic psychology, well, you're going to hear stories like that. And it is important to understand how it could develop in a family situation and how it went unnoticed or unreported, undocumented. And then people die and get away with it. Like, this is a story worth tuning into. So thanks for tuning in today on Killer Psychologist. And of course, we got merch now, Killer Psychologist merch that's out. And I'm obsessed with my coffee mug everywhere I go.
Mine's on the way.
I wore my Killer Psychologist sweatshirt to a jail interview yesterday. No one notices. I wish they would, but anyways, I'm going to give them out to deputies at the jail. They just don't know it yet. Anyway.
Oh, they're going to love that.
They don't even know it yet, but they're going to love it. You can find out more on killerpsychologist.com. You can find out more about us on psychologydoctor.com. So we got Dr. Wetterer up there too. So you can book an appointment or consult with either one of us on your case and tune in for the next episode. Anything that you want to hear, any topic you want to hear about, connect with us on social media and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. And if we have enough advance notice, we can research it a little bit and go into it at a deeper level. So we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Killer Psychologist video episodes are now on YouTube, and you can post your responses there. For episode details and merch, check out killerpsychologistpodcast.com. And for forensic services, you can book online at psychologydr.com. That's psychologydoctor.com.